Welcome to the Sacred Ancestry Podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Worm, and today we have Kelly Moriarty, and I'm so excited for her story because she's a veterinarian by trade and got burned out and overwhelmed and had some anxiety going on with the profession, and now she's a yoga teacher, has a gym with her husband, and just an amazing story of transformation from anxiety to a beautiful life. And yeah, can you tell us more about yourself, Kelly?
Hey Tom, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I sure can. So my name's Kelly, and yeah, when I was growing up, being a vet wasn't the thing that I was really wanting to do, but it ticked a lot of boxes for me. I wanted to do something where I was using my brain. I was always very good academically. I wanted to do something scientific, something that would be helpful, and I'll be honest, I wanted to have a profession that was perhaps a certain status or was a, well respected profession. And so I went into veterinary science, and it's a 5 year degree, and it's pretty full on. It's like having a full time job, just doing the study. And then when I graduated, I moved across the country to the other side, and Australia is a big country, over to Western Australia to work in mixed practice because I wanted to do farm animals as well as small animals. And I realized pretty quickly that the veterinary industry, when I started out, I was really thrown in the deep end, and I think that's quite the norm actually. I was, doing surgeries with very little kind of support or help. I was doing a lot of after hours work, visiting farms and coming into the clinic in the middle of the night to do cesareans and things like that. And this was all in my first year out of school. And so it was very full on, but I always had this drive in me that I can do it. I've just got to work really hard and prove myself and all of those things. So I spent a couple of years there and had a holiday back to the East Coast where my parents were staying. And when I got back, I realised, I'm really unhappy here. I'm working way too hard for very little money, and I can't see anything changing. So I decided to move across the country with my partner who I'd met over there. And we moved back to the East Coast, and then I started working in more small animal practice. And whilst I didn't experience the same level of kind of full onness as working in a mixed practice where you always on call, always working overtime, very kind of masculine workplace as well. You can imagine a 20-something-year-old girl turning up at a farm to treat the cow, and the farmer looks at you and they're used to getting the boss out, who's a 50-year-old man who's been out to the farm for 20 years. It was a tough industry to go out in, but I really had this drive of like, I've got to prove myself, and I know I can do it, and I'm just going to work really hard, and I'll stay back even later than everybody else, and I'll do all the extras just to prove myself. And when I went into the small animal practice, to be honest, it was similar, but in a different way. I think it was really just about the culture of the industry. It was just work, but still very, very masculine, unfortunately. Most of the practice owners were men. And so in my class, most of the vet students were women. It was largely female dominated, but all of the practice owners and all of the bosses and the employers were male. So there was still it was still a tough industry from that perspective, but then also the hours, the lack of lunch breaks, the staying back 2-3 hours after work, because patients need you, and you do what you've got to do. And yeah, I got to a point where it was just not sustainable for me anymore, and everything kind of came to a head. Prior to that, I felt like that was just the norm, everyone got stressed out, everyone got headaches, everyone had backache, everyone, whinged about their jobs and all of those kinds of things. And surely everyone came home at the end of the day and just slumped onto the couch and hoped it was the weekend soon. And I couldn't see outside of the life that I was living and the life that I'd created, if that makes sense.
Wow, yeah, I think that's so common for so many people to, what I'm really hearing about your story is it really became a normalized anxiety, a normalized overwork, a normalized burnout in this. I think there's so many people out there that are, just hoping it's the weekend every single day at work, and I love the way you phrase that, and I'm curious on like how did your anxiety manifest? Like, what was your anxiety about, and what were some things that helped you really overcome that in your journey?
I'd previously experienced anxiety in different ways, and I'd never really pinned it down to being anxiety, I guess. I'd always been an anxious type, where I was sort of just very perfectionist, high achieving, people pleasing, um, and uh, and then during high school and university, I actually started picking at my face, which might sound a bit odd. However, for me, it was just sort of something that you did. Everyone gets pimples or whatever, but for me, it really became a problem, and I would do it habitually and compulsively. And eventually, I actually went to see a psychologist about it after a friend suggested that I do it, and and when I went to see the psychologist, actually, they kind of looked at me a bit funny and had to Google what I was saying because perhaps it's not that common. However, it turned out it was just an obsessive compulsive kind of manifestation of anxiety. And so that's when I really started to think, okay, well, there's there is something going on here, and probably that was like I said, a manifestation of um, an anxiety that I'd probably been carrying around with me for a long time and really didn't realize because you don't really know if something's say normal or abnormal or heightened or whatever. If it's your reality, it's just the way things are for you. And so when I started to look into that and start reading and take things into my own hands, I realized that my anxiety response, and we'll touch on that if that's all right in a moment, but my anxiety response was definitely very heightened, and a lot of the things that I was doing, the overworking, the seeking validation, and trying to prove myself, and all of these behaviors, as well as other things, the reasons that we do all of the things we do, whether it's our eating habits or working out or the way that we speak in our relationships, a lot of that stuff can come from anxiety, and if we have this heightened anxiety response, then it can filter out into these other areas of our lives, and until we something kind of makes us think about it, it's just normal for us. And so I just wanted to just say there, I say anxiety response because a big part of what I do in coaching women with this is getting them to understand that anxiety is actually a really natural response in the human brain. And so I never really, I'll catch myself occasionally, but I don't like to say that I have anxiety. I say that I experience anxiety because I think that everybody experiences some level of anxiety. It is a survival response in the human brain, but for some of us, we're just much more prone to experiencing it, and then obviously experiencing all of the symptoms and stuff that goes with it as well. And so that's, I suppose, what I was noticing in my life is a lot of the things that I was doing that I was trying to fix. And when it came to kind of crunch time with my vet job, I had chronic back pain, I had gut issues, I was constantly becoming unwell. I had, I'd get 3 or 4 colds every year. Um, and when I really dug into it, I realized that at the root of all of those things, even though for my back I was going to see, a physiotherapist, I was going to see an osteopath, I even tried acupuncture. I tried all these modalities just for my back. And then when it came to these gut infections, I was going to the doctor, I was going to this person and that person. But at the root of everything was this stress, anxiety, kind of burnout continuum that I was sitting on. And I realized that I was just constantly pushing myself towards that burnout end of the scale. And so if I wanted to get on top of all of the little things in my life that that I felt I needed to fix, really I had to go back and look at my anxiety response and my stress levels, and really take a look at what I was doing in my life, how I was spending my time and energy, and figure out if it was actually what I wanted or not.
Wow, that's such an amazing story. And, for me personally, my healing journey the last couple years has been based around anxiety as well. And for me, it really manifested all the way into, back pain, neck pain, basically inflammation across the whole body, gut issues. Um, I had dilated pupils and headaches and fevers. I mean, it got really serious by the end of before I kind of cleared out my anxiety and started getting better. But what's so amazing is like what you're saying is that you went to all these medical professionals, and I'm curious, was that helping, or was it more the mindset, the mind shift that was the ultimate change for you?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the nail, hit the nail on the head there, because one of the things that was so frustrating, for example, with my back pain was, by that point I was practicing yoga regularly. I've always been a fit, healthy person who's played sports and done all sorts of things. But at that point, I'd been practicing a type of yoga. I'd certified as a yoga teacher, as that first yoga certificate. And I had a scientific medical degree, I knew the anatomy of the body, I know how inflammation works, I had this wealth of knowledge, and I couldn't figure it out. Why couldn't I fix my back? It just drove me insane. And so I went specifically, or more so, I went down the physiotherapy route. And so I was getting all of these things that I needed to do, these exercises, specific muscles I need to work on. And that's what my scientific brain wanted. I wanted to know the exact muscle that was too tight, and all I had to do was stretch it, right? And then that would make me better. And I would have gone so many times over the course of a year or two. Yeah, would have easily been 2 years. And each time I might get a little shift, and nope, it wouldn't get better, or it would get worse, or it would change to a different thing, and I just couldn't get on top of it. And I was so frustrated because I felt like I'm a smart person, I know the body. Why can't I figure this out? And like you said, it was the mindset shift that had to happen. I really had to come at it from a completely different angle. And I think if you've until you get to that point where you have to consider other options, or what you believe in isn't working, it's really hard to listen to someone saying, "Oh, you have back pain. You need to, help your anxiety, or control your stress levels." That sounds crazy to you until you get to the point where you've done all the other stuff and it hasn't worked.
Yeah, and I think you're really hitting at something I wanted to ask you. And earlier, before the podcast, we were talking about how this medical degree that you had in veterinarian was really medicalized, right? Like maybe your mindset was medicalized in that way, coming from the degree, and you found alternative therapies to help you. And I'm just curious on, like, what was that journey like to go from more of this doctor mindset to maybe something slightly different, more alternative? Like you're saying that this experience really challenged your beliefs, and I'm curious if it challenged your beliefs kind of about everything, mind, body, spirit, from everything in your life to all the way down to the spiritual, right?
Yeah, it really did. It really, yeah, it took a long time, as you can imagine, I guess, when you've spent 5 years at university studying medicine, and then 5 years in the medical field. Even though I wasn't in human medicine, and I would think perhaps that uh, perhaps it was a little easier for me to pull out of that mindset than it would be for someone in the human medical professions, uh, because I wasn't quite as immersed. And the people around me, you're very influenced by the people around you, right? That's your normality. Is that a word? That's your reality and what's normal for you. Uh, so perhaps it was a little bit easier for me to pull away. However, I think uh, that the people that I started to associate with did have a big impact on that mindset shift beginning to happen. So there was a couple of people really, and And it came initially through the yoga. So just starting to explore yoga and thinking about how things work and connect mind, body, just holistically, really, and energetically. And then when I started teaching and actually shifted away from the veterinary career and actually started spending more time in yoga studios and gyms and natural health places, then I was really immersed with people who thought differently. And so that became more my reality. And so it became much easier then to shift that mindset and to open myself up to considering a different way of actually going about looking after myself and seeking therapies. It helps, I guess, that I've always been a little fearful of doctors, and I think I mentioned before the show that I have a needle phobia. So if I can avoid going to a doctor's surgery, I definitely will. So it's always been in me to seek out natural therapies that make sense in my brain. If we can keep things as natural as possible, that makes sense to me. But it did take a long time to actually peel myself away from that medicalized way of seeing things, which is really that, everything is from a textbook, and when you have a problem, you just go to the textbook and you do the thing that it says in the textbook, rather than, okay, here's a person, and what's going on with that person, rather than, okay, what's wrong with the back? Let's fix the back. Really, we need to be sort of stepping back and going, okay, what's going on with the person that's manifesting in the back? And if I could hear myself probably 10 something years ago, I probably would have thought, oh, what's she on about, but now I know it to be true in my own body, so it makes it very easy to believe.
So I'm curious if this really raised maybe your attention or your awareness to, and I imagine the medical system is completely different in Australia. I really don't know, but here in the States, it's really all about if you go to a medical doctor, a MD, a Western doctor, right? They're gonna, like you said, just parse out the whole body and look at an ailment and say, what can we do? What pill can we use for this? And there's no, I guess some of my experience, I've been to the doctor here and there the last 10 years, right? And they're never even looking at you. They don't even look at you. They're looking at their clipboard or their computer, and there's not even a connection with the doctor at all. And I'm curious if this, in my mind, I think this is kind of the foundation of the healthcare crisis in our country, is that we don't have a medical care system that's necessarily helping us, right? And I'm curious on just your opinion on that, coming from, across seas and in Australia, and your view in the States as well.
Yeah, you probably brought up quite a few points there that I could talk on. I suppose in Australia we are lucky in that we have a free medical system where you can access healthcare if needed, and for life saving and medical emergencies, essentially you'll get looked after here. Um, but of course, all of the other stuff, the random things or the just more regular things, then it depends which path you take. However, it is very fragmented, as you were kind of saying. When you go to, it's certainly been my experience. When you go to a doctor, it's very rare that they kind of sum up the whole person or have a proper look. And I think similarly to the veterinary industry, time pressure is a big part of that. Often we're scheduling in 10-minute consultations. Well, it's very hard to get to the bottom of a problem in 10 minutes and then give out the, remedy or talk about how to make changes and that kind of thing inside of that consultation time. So I do understand that. But at the same time, it's definitely been my experience. And since having my son, I've been to the doctors just only a couple of times, I think, and very much the same as you suggested. They're just looking at their computer, asking the questions from the script, and that's about it, and then talking about the medications that you might need. But I mean, from a yoga perspective and just being the work that I do in the gym and seeing people in that way for nutrition and things like that, often people will come into the gym or yoga, for example, and they've got an issue, say, let's just go down the back pain route again, and they'll say, oh, the doctor sent me for an MRI. So they go somewhere and have the MRI, and then they go back to the doctor, and then the doctor says, I'm sending you to see the surgeon. So then they go to see the surgeon, they have a consultation with the surgeon. And often and it happens all the time, but often when people say that to me, I don't perhaps physically shudder in front of them, but I certainly internally shudder, because I think if you're going to see a surgeon, it's very likely that they're going to talk to you about surgery, because that's what they do. And if you go to see a medical doctor, they're going to talk to you about medicine, because that's what they do. That's what they're trained in: disease and the medicines that will help. And so it is very hard to go to a doctor and actually get looked at properly, and have all of the things considered, and then have some kind of a clue as to what to do next. Um, yeah, and it is endlessly frustrating for me, that's for sure, and I'm sure it is for many, many other women. Certainly, a lot of the women that I speak to, it's really hard to get anywhere, because everything is done somewhere different, and that's a big difference in the veterinary industry. In the veterinary industry, when you bring your animal in to see, say, me, and your dog needs an X-ray, blood tests, and it needs some pathology done, or maybe a surgery, I'm going to do all of those things. I'm taking the X-rays, I'm reading the X-rays, I'm taking the blood draw, I'm putting it through the machine, I'm reading the results, so I'm getting a really good overview of the whole animal, and and then if my patient and my client goes to another veterinary clinic, that clinic will call me and say, hey, this dog's turned up. I can see they said that, you used to be their vet. Can you send me the history? I said, yeah, sure. And so then I'll go and get the nurse or receptionist. Can you send Buster's history, full history, over to this veterinary clinic, because they've just turned up there? And so their entire medical and surgical and everything history goes to that new doctor. Whereas, I'm not sure in the US, in Australia, they've only just started with it's called my health record or something like that. A database has only just been sort of created to allow other doctors to see if you've been, what you've been doing with other doctors. And so up until very recently, and a lot of people actually opted out of it for security reasons and things like that as well. But you could go to 5 different doctors in a day and get the same prescription for the same medication from every single one of them, because there was no communication between doctors. And as a vet, that's crazy to me, because who's really looking after that person?
Right. Yeah, I think that's such an amazing perspective just from the vet world, and wow, just to hear about how you're doing all the testing, the x-rays, the surgeries, the top to bottom of the animal. That is amazing. I can see where the time and pressure is really hardcore. And I kind of want to shift a little bit into what you're doing now, and I want to just start with yoga, and tell us more about your yoga journey and what kind of yoga you're doing and how yoga has really changed your life.
I will talk about yoga all day, Tom. So with I started practicing yoga. I've always had an inkling for it, and so I had when I was little, I had a video VHS, and I had a little book that I would use, and so I've always sort of been interested, yoga curious, and then I practiced a little bit when I went to Western Australia for my first veterinary job over there. I didn't realize the type of yoga at the time, but then it became apparent later on. And then when I moved back to the East Coast, I started going to hot yoga, which I thought at the time was just the most fabulous thing in the world. I got such a buzz from it. I felt really good, and I felt like surely this was going to help my back. And what happened was it got worse. And I've just added to the frustration, because I thought, how can this be? I'm a yoga teacher. I'm doing all this yoga and it's not helping. And that's when I found Iyengar yoga, which is the yoga that I teach and practice now. And Iyengar yoga, if you don't know what it is, it's a style of yoga that was developed by a man called BKS Iyengar, who passed away a few years ago. And when he was young, he was quite unwell, and their family in India couldn't afford a lot of medical treatment or seeking doctors, etc. So a family friend had said to them, "You need to do yoga, and yoga is the way that the only way that you'll be able to improve your health if you don't have any money. So he started practicing, and then of course over his life he taught right up into his 90s before he passed away. However, he was very dedicated and practiced for hours every day. But over his lifetime, he developed the use of props, which is all of the things that we see now, even on Instagram, all the blocks and the belts and the bolsters and chairs and things like that. He really developed that system of using those props so that really anyone could do a pose and get the benefit out of it, even if they couldn't necessarily do the pose otherwise. And then he started seeing more and more students who had medical issues. He would then receive referrals from doctors and doctors that he had as his students would say, I've got this patient, they need this done. And he would say, give me 3 months. Otherwise you can have them back. And, and so over his lifetime, decades of practice and experience, he became very good, I guess, or excellent at looking at a person and working with them and with their body and using the props and the postures in such a way that he could create a beneficial healing effect. And so now I practice and teach this style of yoga, and it's very structured and it's very anatomical and alignment based and very precise and particular, that from the outside other yoga practitioners often say, "Oh, Iyengar yoga, it's so strict and regimented, and it's they don't like it because of that view of things." However, it's because of that precision, I really managed to heal and get my back, really great, really great, and I maintain it at that level now, and I'm able to practice all the poses that I thought I would never be able to do because of that level of mindfulness and precision. But I guess the key thing is that it's about being acutely observant and aware, and about really connecting and noticing what's going on in your body. And then when something comes up, whether that's a sensation or an intensity, actually trying to not get stuck in it, but kind of just draw back a bit and say, is that pain or is that discomfort? And is that pain or discomfort, like, what is it telling me? Because really everything that we receive from our body is information, right? And for most of us, especially in the Western world, and particularly if you have a highly medicalized view and very mainstream, we're really kind of taught to ignore our body's signals. And that's what I did for many, many years. I ignored the fatigue and the low immune system and the back pain and the infections and all of these things that I was getting. I would, as best as I could, just push them to the side and keep going, because I felt like that was what you do. And so yoga in that way really helped me to just change my mindset around that and actually start paying attention to my body. And then when you develop that and cultivate that through yoga practice, you then become very acutely aware of your body and what it's telling you. And so it means that you can actually preempt things, rather than completely burning out. You can start to observe yourself and think, okay, my energy is getting actually really low. That's not a reason to have a double shot espresso or pick something up from the pharmacy. It's actually a reason to slow down, take a little bit more rest, figure out where I'm overloaded, and actually just change what I'm doing rather than masking symptoms. So it's really interesting. And I mean, it was, I don't know, divine intervention or whatever, but that yoga came into my life. And when I was, as that kinesiologist friend said, I was breaking open and kind of going through this this shift in my life, and yoga helps so much in doing that, because it really grounded me in my body, and it gave me a physical discipline and practice to come back to and just keep getting in touch and just keep getting in touch, and it still does that for me now.
Wow, that is so amazing. I love that story, and everything you put in there is so wonderful. And I'm curious if the yoga practice, Well, I guess I'll go back a little bit. For me, I truly believe that our body, like you said, is speaking to us every second of the day. And when we don't pay attention, it just festers and it gets our attention even harder until we finally notice, an illness or a disease, right? But if we can just slow down and listen to our body and exactly like you're saying, changing our routine or changing a food or changing something in our life, that whole mindset, that whole perception can totally change, right? And I guess I'm curious, I want to ask is if in yoga, in your practice, is there like, have you ever seen or witnessed or noticed inside yourself, moving emotions, letting stuck emotions go through the body, through the yoga poses and things like that?
Um, yes, and yes. So it's interesting because one of the things that drew me to Iyengar yoga and why I love Iyengar yoga is that it's very matter of fact. The spiritual stuff, the philosophy, it's really taught from a very practical foundation. So when we teach beginners, we do a few standing postures. We get them to look at their feet, make sure they're pointing straight. Then we change our pose. We come back and then we look at our feet and make sure they're still pointing straight. We get them to extend out into their arms and just sort of get them doing really basic things. And the practice just builds up and builds up. And at the start, the even shavasana, which is the lying down at the end, just having that rest period, for beginners, it's very short, and we talk the whole way through it because, and you see this when you teach, when beginners come into the room and lie down and they're not doing anything, it's awkward in there. They're fidgeting, but I've had one lady sit up and look at me as if to say, well, what am I supposed to be doing? Lying still or doing nothing is so foreign to us that we really have to start with just move the body, feel how it moves, make it move a bit more. And then once we kind of break down the stiffness in the body and start to get some connection, then we start introducing a bit more of the restorative, the slower stuff. And then the pranayama, which is the breathing, that's, comes after some time practicing the physical stuff. Because if you take someone off the street, say me 10 years ago, and you tell them to sit down and breathe, that's just enough to cause a panic attack on its own because we're just not used to it. And it's really, all of a sudden we have to actually sit with ourselves and experience things and actually feel what's going on in our bodies. And it's such a huge shock for most of us because we're not practiced at it, and we're actually, for the most part, encouraged against it. I believe, as we're growing up in a modern Western kind of world. There's a couple of ways, I suppose, that I've experienced a shift in my body. One would be just literally over time in practice, whereby it's interesting, when I was doing the first kind of yoga, I would look up these really cool, really hard poses, and then I would look up how do I get into that, and there would be specific stretches and work on this and work on that, and eventually you can do this pose. Whereas in Iyengar yoga, you just keep doing the standing poses and the sitting poses, the basic stuff, and you do it more and more and more, and you build up slowly and slowly and slowly. And what I found when I switched over to this type of yoga and then started practicing it, that I had to then pull away. And I used to do loads of arm balances and all of these kind of fun things that I thought were really cool. And then when I started learning Iyengar yoga, which is like almost 3 years to get certified as a teacher in Iyengar yoga, it's very strict with how they do it, which is a great thing because it means your teacher is well experienced by the time they pass their exam. But in that time, it was back to basics, back to foundations. I remember going to my first Iyengar class and I got adjusted about 30 times by the teacher, and I was already teaching yoga at that point. I was so mortified. I couldn't believe it. And that really made me think, okay, I need to go and figure out more about this Iyengar yoga because obviously I'm not doing things right. And so it was funny because then after practicing, going back to the basics, learning, practicing so much practice leading up to that first exam. And then, say a year, two down the track, I realized that I really wasn't practicing many of those cool poses that I used to practice. And then when I went to do them, I found them really achievable. I could just do them, you know. And so the shift that came with that happened just over time and practice. And the same with my hips. I remember trying to get into Padmasana, which is that lotus pose, you know, one leg's coming up, other leg over the top of it. It looks like the classic kind of yoga pose. I remember very early on just thinking there must be something wrong with my body. I will never get into that pose because my hips just wouldn't allow it. It was not possible. And it's only with years of practice and persistence, not at doing that pose, but just generally practicing, you know, that now I can do it, and I can't imagine really not being able to do it. So it's really interesting in that way. You say about kind of experiencing a shift. That shift came and continues to come over years of practice. And then other times when I've experienced a quicker shift, I guess the biggest one, which I think probably you'll appreciate, but I was doing my yoga teacher training with my Iyengar yoga teacher, and we did a week-long retreat as part of the teacher training. And every morning we had to get up and go into the hall at, I don't know, 6 o'clock or something. It was dark, it's winter. And we'd lay out over the blankets to do, I think it was about 45 minutes of pranayama, which is breathing. And the teacher would come in, she would lead the breathing practice. That was the first time I'd committed to doing some breathing every day. And it's quite a big session to do that every morning. However, over the course of that week, and at that time my back had been still quite bad. I was really still struggling with it, even though I was starting to learn this new Iyengar yoga, which was new for me at the time. Over that week, I really experienced a shift, and it was interesting because a couple of the sequences that we were practicing during the day, she would sort of say to me, come over here, there's two of us that were having some back hip issues. You're going to do it this way, do a couple of these things, that will just help settle things down. However, the bulk of the time we were just doing what everyone else was doing. There was nothing particularly special about how we were practicing that was physically helping my back. However, we were doing these long breathing sessions every morning, and I really experienced a shift after that. And I put it down to the fact that two things. One, every morning I was laying down and being acutely aware of my body and what was happening as I was breathing for a whole 45 minutes. And I started to notice that if I didn't catch myself, when I breathed in, my left hip flexor would tighten and my left hip would start to lift up and draw towards me. And I learned, even just over that course of that week, that as I inhaled, I could catch it and let it go. And by the end of the week, obviously that was easier to do. It was still happening a little bit, but it was easier to do. So that was part of it. But then also I think just the release of those secondary stabilizers in the body. So the diaphragm, deeper abdominal muscles that we really don't know about, but are often just tight and tense with stress and anxiety in the way that we hold ourselves and we hold emotion in our bodies. The use of the breath in those pranayama sessions just really unlocked that part of my body. And going forward from then, things have been really different. So it's really interesting because it wasn't, I wouldn't have been able to get to that at the start, you know. At the start, it was like if I got a really good stretch, then, I might feel like, my hip's much more open then. But of course, I wasn't doing really the deeper work. And so the tightness would just come back like a rubber band, you know, you stretch something and it just snaps back. And then you think, I thought I stretched that. Why isn't it fixed? But I think that when you get to the bottom of these things, even just physical muscular tightness and tension, there's usually something else that's creating that. You know, something has to be triggering those muscles to be gripped and to be holding on. And yeah, I did experience that shift over that week because I was open to it and because I was able to lie down and be observant for that period of time, which at the start I definitely would not have been able to do.
Oh, that is so cool. I love that story. And because the yoga really does allow you to come back into your body. And that's kind of what I'm getting most out of there is that you really learned how to come back into your body, or that's the way I think of it anyway. My journey with anxiety was I was so far out in the future or so far in the past that I was never really aware of what was happening in my body at all. It was just, and when I came back, it was such a different experience to just breathe and be here now, right? And I want to pivot here just a little bit and ask you, how are you moving forward with this? I know you're a yoga teacher and you own a gym and you have a lot of courses with stress and anxiety. Like, how do you put all this together and help women with stress and anxiety? What does that look like? And what are some of the successes you've had with your clients?
The so I, it's interesting because it's COVID is happening right now, and so I'm sitting in my yoga studio now, but there's no one around. There's no classes happening, so I'm teaching online via Zoom, which has been actually kind of nice. It means I've been at home a lot more, which I've enjoyed personally. But also, my students have been able to shift from just being instructed to actually being in their own space. A lot of them set up a yoga room now. They've got all the yoga props. And so it's given them a bit more confidence to be able to do this practice, which, in yoga, that's our goal, is to really help people to learn the practice so that they can help themselves when they need to. It's a lifelong practice. So I feel actually it's been a nice gift for for me and for my students in the yoga sense, because I feel it has taken them a step further to actually being able to make this a lifelong practice for themselves. So the yoga will continue in some capacity, and then other than that, I have my online business called the Green Body Plan, and the base for that, I guess, is the Facebook group, which where I go live every week and just deliver different videos about different topics. Talked about hormones and how that manifests in changes in energy and stress and anxiety and things like that. Natural supplements, things that I've used, things that I use with my clients, things like that. And then I have a stress and anxiety course, which I released recently, and a membership as well. So, a monthly membership where we, as women, can get together online. We do a workshop, and yeah, just keep coming back to ourselves and learning new things about health and about. I really want to give women the everyone talks about empowerment, I know, but I really want to give women the confidence in their own intuition. I think it's really important for women because, particularly, when I had my son, that's a whole that's a whole different ball game when you become pregnant and then go through that journey into motherhood. It's very easy to be sucked into this medical system that treats pregnancy as a disease, and that everything's going to go wrong unless you make sure you test for everything, and to rule everything out. And so, particularly after that experience, I really wanted to, one, be able to reach more women, which is, online is a great way to do that, but also just to be able to transfer my knowledge and experience in stress and anxiety management, but also really a lot of what we've been talking about, which is actually getting in touch with your body again, learning to listen and to be observant, and not to actually fear things that we notice, but to be more curious about what's going on, and investigative, and just interested, and come from a place of curiosity rather than of something's wrong with me, I need to go and seek some external thing to fix it. Instead of that, building up our own knowledge and cultivating that intuition that we all have, and so that women can be more proactive in looking after their own health, but also just to feel more confident and feel more okay about being them, being who they are, and not needing to go externally and go outward for these solutions, when I feel like, for the most part, mm, the answers are probably in front of us. We've had our blindfolds and our earmuffs in for too long, and so we just need to be just reconnecting and keeping ourselves in touch, but also just learning to observe and to pay attention and to feel that intuition coming through, so that we can act confidently from that intuition, rather than going to the textbook and external stuff. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. And for my anxiety journey, it manifested as hypochondriac, very much so. And so any little pain in a foot or pain in my back was so just devastating. Like, of course, I'm gonna die now because I have pain in my foot, right? That's where my mind would go every single time. And it took so long to really come back, like you're saying, to that intuition of like, no, I can actually ask my body, like, what do I need right now to help this pain go away? What do I need to change? Or how can I reframe this pain into something
Yeah.
good, right? And I think that's such a beautiful way, like you're saying, is to bring these women back into their intuition and back into their body, and really just, it's so interesting the way you said that pregnancy is treated like a disease. I just cannot even imagine what that's like, for women. That's a really interesting phrase. I feel like we could do a whole podcast on that, right? Yeah, that's so interesting. And I just want to make sure I mirror that the intuition and coming back to like, no, we can't control our body, we can't control our thoughts and our feelings is so important. And I just thank you for the work that you're doing. It's just amazing. Thank you. And where can people find you? Where can they get in touch with you? Where can they enroll in your courses and all that?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So the website is thegreenbodyplan.com, and you'll find links to everything on there. Um, my podcast is the Green Body Podcast, and if you are a woman who's resonating with my story and wanting some resources, some free resources, or maybe just to jump on to those weekly videos, then the Facebook group is called Stress and Anxiety Management for Ambitious Women. So it's a really good community, and I'm always in there discussing things and delivering loads of good stuff in there. So that's definitely the place to jump into as well.
That's so awesome. And from my point of view, for everybody listening out there, if you're in wildland fire and you're a woman, I know I've seen it, with my 14 years out there on the line. It sounds like the exact same, you know, almost the same environment that Kelly's talking about. This masculinity is just overwhelming. It's really hard to prove yourself to everybody, and there's so many parallels with what you're talking about, Kelly, and the struggle that wildland fire women have. I think they really should reach out to you because you could be a powerful coach for them. And I think there is a lot of anxiety being surrounded by men, and being in that environment is just so hard for some people. And I just encourage all of you listening to really reach out, and if you need help with anxiety and yoga, this is your girl here, Kelly. So thank you so much for the podcast and this amazing conversation. And do you have any last thoughts you wanna put out there before we close out?
I suppose I'll just come back to the point of anxiety being a natural response of the human brain, and I think the standard medical or external reach for some kind of fix is that we take away the symptoms of anxiety and with medication. And what I like to really get across to people is that anxiety is such a human function of the brain, that we've had it for thousands and thousands of years, and so we're not looking to get rid of it. And in fact, getting rid of that anxiety response would be dangerous to our survival and the way our brain works. So I think that's really the first reframe or mindset shift that we need to have when we're thinking about anxiety, is not this problem that we've been diagnosed with or this disease that we've, picked up somewhere, that it's just a natural thing going on in our system. And so that if we can understand it better, then we can start to figure out what triggers it, why it perhaps is an over response or a hyper response, and then what we can do to actually take matters into our own hands and actually help ourselves out. So I think the best thing about this whole everything we've talked about, is feeling a sense of control. When we don't have a sense of control over what we're experiencing, it's very scary, and it's not a very nice place to be in, and a nice way to live. So if we can create a sense of control, which we absolutely can, it's a much nicer way to go about life. And that really starts with understanding that anxiety is a natural response in the human body, and go from there.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and bringing us wisdom. And I really appreciate everything you've said. And I love your story. And you're welcome to come back to the podcast anytime. And it'll be an amazing conversation. I know it. And for all the listeners, thank you for listening. And you can find me at mountainmindtricks.com and Thomas M. Worm on Facebook. And you can find everything else from there. And please, I encourage you to go out there and go find your sacred ancestry. All right. We'll talk to you on the next one.